In the glass-walled conference room of a Chicago marketing firm, Catherine Sloan was about to face the most humiliating moment of her career. What started as a routine team meeting took a shocking turn when her manager began reading aloud from her most private therapy emails, weaponizing her mental health struggles against her in front of horrified colleagues. Catherine wasn't your typical junior account manager. For 6 months, she had been methodically documenting her boss's surveillance network, discovering a web of privacy violations that stretched far beyond her own violated inbox. When David Brennan chose public humiliation over professional decency, he had no idea he was pushing someone who possessed the digital evidence to destroy his marriage, his career, and his carefully constructed lies in a single, devastating email to his unsuspecting wife. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Catherine Sloan returned from her lunch break, a half-eaten turkey sandwich wrapped in brown paper tucked under her arm. The marketing firm's open-plan office buzzed with the usual afternoon energy, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, and the distant murmur of client calls filtering through glass-walled conference rooms. She approached her desk with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, already mentally organizing her afternoon tasks. But something was wrong. Catherine paused 3 feet from her workstation, her trained eye catching the subtle irregularities that others might have missed. Her monitor, which she always adjusted to exactly 22 inches from the edge of her desk, sat at least an inch closer. The wireless keyboard, normally positioned at a perfect 90-degree angle to her mousepad, was askew. Most telling of all, her ergonomic chair, which she'd spent weeks adjusting to the perfect height after her first day 6 months ago, was raised 2 notches higher than she'd left it. Her chest tightened with a familiar anxiety, memories of childhood surfacing unbidden. The way her mother would rifle through her backpack while she showered, claiming she was quote 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 quote. The sensation of coming home to find her diary moved from its hiding place beneath her mattress, her father's gruff explanation that parents have a right to know what their children are up to. The violation was the same, even if the context had shifted from suburban bedroom to corporate cubicle. Catherine set her lunch down with deliberate calm and settled into her chair, lowering it to its proper height with muscle memory. She pressed the spacebar to wake her computer, entering her password with steady fingers despite the tremor of unease building in her stomach. Her desktop appeared, everything seemingly normal at first glance. But Catherine Sloan was nothing, if not thorough. She opened her browser history first, scanning the timestamps from her lunch hour. Nothing unusual there. The last entry was from 11:47 a.m., when she'd closed a client research tab before heading to the deli downstairs. Next, she checked her recently accessed files. Again, nothing suspicious. It was only when she clicked on her personal Gmail tab, a browser window she kept minimized, but always open for family emergencies, that her blood ran cold. The inbox showed she'd been reading emails 20 minutes ago at 1:15 p.m. But at 1:15 p.m., Catherine had been standing in line at Romano's Deli, chatting with Mrs. Chen about the weather while waiting for her turkey sandwich. She never checked personal email during lunch. It was a boundary she'd established to maintain some semblance of work-life balance. With growing dread, she clicked on her recently read folder. Email after email bore fresh timestamps from the past hour. Her therapy appointment confirmations. Messages from her sister about their father's drinking. A heated exchange with her ex-boyfriend from 3 weeks ago that she'd thought about deleting but hadn't quite brought herself to. Most damning of all, a message from her therapist's office about rescheduling her Wednesday session, an email that contained explicit references to her anxiety disorder and childhood trauma. Catherine's hands trembled as she took screenshots, her MBA training in documentation overriding her emotional shock. Timestamp 1:12 p.m., email from Dr. Martinez's office, opened. Timestamp 1:16 p.m., personal message from her sister Sarah, marked as read. Timestamp 1:19 p.m., conversation thread with her college roommate about her struggles adjusting to corporate life, completely reviewed. Someone had been here. Someone had read months of her most private thoughts and vulnerabilities while she'd been ordering lunch. The realization hit her like a physical blow. In her childhood home, privacy had been a luxury her parents refused to grant. She'd spent years in therapy learning to establish boundaries, to trust her own judgment, to believe that she deserved basic respect and dignity. And now, in what should have been her professional safe space, someone had violated those hard-won boundaries with the casual indifference of someone checking the weather. "Catherine? Everything all right?" David Brennan's voice made her jump. Her manager stood behind her cubicle, coffee mug in hand, wearing his trademark concerned expression that never quite reached his eyes. David was the kind of manager who called himself a collaborative leader, while micromanaging every detail of his team's work. At 38, he possessed the smooth charm of someone who'd learned to disguise his insecurities behind a veneer of professional concern. "David?" Catherine minimized her email window and turned to face him, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to speak with you about something." "Of course. My office?" His smile widened, but Catherine caught the quick flicker of his eyes toward her computer screen before she'd closed it. In David's glass-walled office, Catherine chose her words carefully. "I have reason to believe someone accessed my personal email account from my workstation during lunch today." David's expression shifted to one of practiced concern. "That's troubling. Are you sure? Sometimes browsers can show false timestamps, especially if there are connectivity issues." "I'm certain." Catherine placed printouts of her screenshots on his desk. "These emails were marked as read while I was physically out of the building. Someone used my computer to access private correspondence." David picked up the papers, his eyes scanning them with what appeared to be professional interest. But Catherine noticed how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when he saw the therapy-related emails. "Well, this is concerning. Though I should mention, Catherine, that we did have a routine security audit today. IT needed to verify that employee workstations weren't compromised. Sometimes that involves checking various accounts to ensure there are no security breaches." The explanation was delivered with such smooth confidence that for a moment Catherine almost believed it. Almost. But she'd worked in digital marketing long enough to know that legitimate IT audits didn't involve reading personal emails. They involved scanning for malware, checking security updates, verifying access permissions. They didn't require someone to sit at her desk and scroll through her private correspondence for 23 minutes. "A security audit wouldn't require reading my personal emails," Catherine said quietly. "Especially not the content of therapy-related messages." David's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing something colder underneath. Then the concerned manager expression returned. "Catherine, I understand you're upset, but I think you might be jumping to conclusions. Security protocols can be complex, and sometimes they require more thorough investigation than we might expect. I'd suggest changing your passwords as a precaution, and we can look into getting you better training on maintaining security boundaries between personal and professional use of company equipment." It was a masterful deflection, taking her legitimate concern and twisting it into a suggestion that she was the one who'd done something wrong. Catherine felt the familiar childhood sensation of being told that her instincts were unreliable, that her sense of violation was just paranoia. But she wasn't 8 years old anymore. "I'll be documenting this incident and reporting it to HR," Catherine said, standing. "I'll also be changing all my passwords and reviewing company policy regarding employee privacy." David's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Of course. Though, Catherine, I do hope you'll consider that sometimes in high-pressure environments like ours, stress can make us interpret normal situations as threats. We have excellent employee assistance programs if you feel like you need someone to talk to about managing workplace anxiety." The dismissal was so smooth, so perfectly calibrated to sound like caring management while actually being a veiled threat, that Catherine almost admired the craftsmanship. He'd managed to reference her therapy emails without explicitly admitting he'd read them, while simultaneously suggesting she was mentally unstable for bringing up the violation. Catherine left his office with measured steps, her back straight, and her expression neutral. But inside, a cold fury was building. She'd spent years learning to trust her instincts, to value her own sense of reality over others' gaslighting. David Brennan had just made a critical error in judgment. He'd assumed she was still the frightened child who would doubt herself when confronted with smooth denials and subtle threats. Back at her desk, Catherine methodically changed every password she could think of, starting with her email and working through her banking, social media, and professional accounts. Each new password was a small act of reclaiming control, a digital boundary drawn in the sand. As the afternoon wore on, she found herself glancing toward David's office, watching him conduct meetings and answer calls with his usual professional demeanor. To anyone else, he looked like exactly what he presented himself as, a dedicated manager focused on team success. But Catherine now saw the calculation behind his gestures, the way his eyes tracked his employees' movements, the subtle signs of someone who viewed surveillance as management. At 4:47 p.m., she sent a carefully worded email to Jessica Torres, the company's junior IT specialist and one of the few people Catherine trusted in the office. Coffee tomorrow morning? I have a technical question about email security that I think you might be able to help with. Jessica's response came back within minutes. Absolutely. 7:30 at Grind Coffee? And Catherine, be careful what you put in email tonight. The warning sent a chill down Catherine's spine. If Jessica was already cautious about email security, it suggested Catherine's suspicions might be the tip of a much larger iceberg. As she prepared to leave for the day, Catherine found herself studying her coworkers with new eyes. How many of them had noticed irregularities they'd dismissed? How many had felt that same nagging sense that their privacy had been violated, but convinced themselves they were being paranoid? The elevator descended to the parking garage in silence, Catherine's reflections staring back at her from the polished steel doors. She looked the same as she had that morning. Professional blazer, neat hair, the composed expression of a competent account manager, but something fundamental had shifted. The woman who'd left for lunch had still believed, on some level, that following the rules and maintaining professional boundaries would protect her. The woman riding down in the elevator knew better. Catherine walked to her Honda Civic with the same measured pace she'd maintained all afternoon, but her mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow's conversation with Jessica. If David Brennan thought he could violate her privacy with impunity, he was about to learn that Catherine Sloan was not the kind of person who suffered in silence. The parking garage's fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she started her car, casting shifting shadows that seemed to mirror the new uncertainty in her professional life. But underneath the anxiety and violation, something else was growing, a cold, determined anger that reminded her of her father's stubborn streak and her mother's relentless attention to detail. David Brennan had crossed a line. Now Catherine was going to find out what other lines he'd crossed, and who else had paid the price for his need to control and surveil. The Honda's engine hummed to life, and Catherine pulled out of the parking spot with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. But, as she drove toward home, her reflection in the rearview mirror showed eyes that held a new kind of determination. The violation had awakened something in Catherine Sloan that she hadn't known was sleeping. And David Brennan was about to discover that some boundaries, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. The parking garage's fluorescent lights had barely faded from Catherine's rearview mirror when the sleepless night began. She lay in her studio apartment, staring at the ceiling while Chicago's traffic hummed 20 floors below, her mind cycling through every detail of the violation. By 3 a.m., she'd given up on sleep entirely and sat cross-legged on her bed with her laptop, researching employee privacy rights and corporate surveillance laws. The coffee shop rendezvous with Jessica couldn't come soon enough. At exactly 7:30 a.m., Catherine pushed through the glass doors of Grind Coffee, the familiar aroma of espresso and pastries greeting her like an old friend. Jessica Torres sat in a corner booth, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, fingers already wrapped around a large cappuccino. At 29, Jessica possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that made her invaluable to the IT department, though Catherine suspected her skills went far beyond routine tech support. "You look like hell," Jessica said without preamble as Catherine slid into the opposite seat. "Didn't sleep." Catherine ordered a black coffee from the hovering barista, then leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Jessica's expression grew serious. "Shoot. Has David ever asked you to access employee computers? Emails, files, anything like that?" The silence stretched for several seconds, Jessica's fingers tightening around her mug. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Catherine hadn't expected. Not directly, but Catherine. There have been requests. Routine security checks that didn't feel routine. System updates that required more access than they should have. Catherine's coffee arrived, but she ignored it. How many people? At least 4 that I know of. Maybe more. Jessica glanced around the coffee shop, then pulled out her phone, typing quickly. I've been documenting things, but I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid. David has a way of making his requests sound perfectly reasonable, like it's all standard IT protocol. The phone slid across the table, showing a notes app filled with dates and cryptic entries. Catherine scanned them quickly. DB request, MPark desktop access, productivity audit, unusual network activity, DB workstation after hours. Password reset rec, multiple accounts DB authorization. Jesus, Catherine whispered. How long has this been going on? 6 months. Maybe longer. Jessica reclaimed her phone. I started keeping records when I noticed patterns. David would request access to specific employees' accounts, usually people who had complained about his management style or seemed resistant to his micromanaging. Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of access? Everything. Email, file shares, browser history, even keylogger data in some cases. Jessica's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I tried to push back once, asked for written authorization from HR. David told me I was being quote, 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 quote. David quote, 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 quote. Cases clicked into place with sickening clarity. Catherine's violation hadn't been a one-time incident. It was part of a systematic pattern of surveillance and control. Who else knows about this? No one, as far as I can tell. David's careful to frame everything as legitimate business needs. And honestly? Jessica stirred her cappuccino with unnecessary force. Most people in IT just follow orders. They don't ask questions about why a manager needs to see his employees' personal emails. Catherine's mind raced through the implications. If David had been monitoring multiple employees for months, what else had he discovered? What other private information was he using to manipulate and control his team? The thought made her stomach turn. I want to see everything, Catherine said quietly. Every request, every access log, every piece of evidence you have. Jessica studied her for a long moment. Catherine, what you're asking for, it could get us both fired. Maybe worse. He violated my privacy. He read months of my personal correspondence, including medical information. Catherine's voice carried an edge she'd never heard before. If he's doing this to other people, they have a right to know. After a pause that felt like an eternity, Jessica nodded. Okay. But not here, and not on company equipment. Can you meet me tonight? My apartment has better security, and I keep backups of everything on isolated drives. They arranged to meet at 8 p.m., splitting the coffee bill like 2 normal coworkers grabbing breakfast before work. But as Catherine walked to her car, she felt anything but normal. The methodical account manager, who'd built her career on following protocols and respecting boundaries, was evolving into something else. Someone willing to bend rules and exploit weaknesses in pursuit of justice. The day at the office passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Catherine attended meetings, responded to emails, and managed client accounts with her usual efficiency. But underneath the professional facade, she was studying David with new eyes, cataloging every interaction and noting patterns she'd previously dismissed. She watched how he positioned himself to see other people's screens during conversations, how he lingered near workstations when employees stepped away, how his casual check-ins always seemed to occur when people were dealing with personal calls or sensitive emails. What she'd once attributed to micromanagement now revealed itself as something far more calculated and invasive. At 5:47 p.m., Catherine gathered her things with the same measured pace she'd maintained all day. But as she waited for the elevator, she noticed David emerging from the IT department, a satisfied expression on his face. Through the glass walls, she could see him talking to Tom Bradley, the senior IT administrator, gesturing toward his tablet while Tom nodded reluctantly. Another routine security check, no doubt. Jessica's apartment building was a converted warehouse in Lincoln Park, all exposed brick and industrial fixtures. Catherine found herself in a space that felt more like a cybersecurity command center than a home. Multiple monitors, sophisticated networking equipment, and what appeared to be a server rack humming quietly in the corner. "Welcome to my digital fortress," Jessica said, gesturing toward a workstation. "Before we start, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to show you could be considered corporate espionage if anyone finds out. Are you sure you want to go down this rabbit hole?" Catherine thought about her violated emails, about David's smooth gaslighting, about the other employees who might be suffering in silence. "I'm sure." What Jessica revealed over the next 2 hours shattered Catherine's remaining faith in workplace boundaries. David hadn't just been accessing personal emails, he'd been conducting systematic surveillance of his entire team, productivity metrics tracked down to the minute. Personal phone calls recorded through computer microphones, even keystroke analysis to monitor typing patterns and identify when employees might be job hunting. "Look at this," Jessica said, pulling up a spreadsheet that made Catherine's blood run cold. "He's been ranking employees based on, quote, loyalty indicators, personal stress levels, financial stability, relationship status, anything that might affect their willingness to challenge his authority." Catherine's name appeared halfway down the list, marked with red flags for therapy sessions, family conflicts, and adjustment difficulties. David hadn't just violated her privacy, he'd been building a psychological profile to identify her vulnerabilities. "There's more," Jessica said quietly. "Network logs show external communications from David's workstation, encrypted files being transmitted to external email addresses. I think he might be sharing confidential information with someone outside the company." Catherine leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of David's violations. What had started as a personal boundary crossing had revealed a web of surveillance, manipulation, and potential corporate espionage that reached far beyond anything she'd imagined. "We need to document everything," Catherine said finally. "Every violation, every breach, every piece of evidence. And then we need to decide what to do with it." Jessica nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "Catherine, you need to understand what we're up against. David isn't just some micromanaging boss. He's built an entire system of control and surveillance. Taking him down won't be easy, and it won't be clean." As Catherine drove home through Chicago's late-night traffic, she realized that Jessica was right. The woman who'd discovered the email violation yesterday had been hoping for an apology and a promise to respect boundaries. The woman driving home tonight understood that David Brennan was a predator who used information as a weapon, and stopping him would require becoming something she'd never imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. The fluorescent lights of her apartment building's lobby cast harsh shadows as she entered, but Catherine barely noticed. Her mind was already planning the next phase of her investigation, cataloging the evidence she'd need to gather and the allies she'd have to recruit. David Brennan had taught her that privacy was an illusion and trust was a liability. Now Catherine was going to use those lessons against him, diving deeper into his digital footprint than he'd ever dared to venture into hers. The methodical account manager was learning to think like a detective, and she was discovering she had a talent for it. The violation had awakened something in Catherine Sloan that couldn't be put back to sleep. And David Brennan was about to discover that some students learned their lessons far too well. The violation had awakened something in Catherine Sloan that couldn't be put back to sleep. 3 days after her revelation-filled evening at Jessica's apartment, Catherine found herself staying late at the office, ostensibly working on quarterly reports while the building emptied around her. But her real purpose was far more dangerous than financial analysis. At 8:47 p.m., she made her move. Using the network monitoring tools Jessica had taught her, Catherine began tracing the encrypted file transfers they discovered in David's network logs. The external email addresses were anonymized, but Catherine's MBA had included enough cybersecurity coursework to help her follow digital breadcrumbs. What she found made her pause at her cubicle, hand frozen over her mouse. The encrypted communications weren't random. They followed a pattern, always sent after client meetings, always containing file attachments that matched the timing of major strategic discussions. Someone was receiving detailed intelligence about the firm's biggest accounts, and that someone was feeding information back to David through equally encrypted channels. Catherine's investigation led her deeper into David's digital footprint than she'd ever intended to go. His email habits revealed a man who thought he was cleverer than he actually was, using basic encryption that Jessica's tools could crack, storing sensitive files in poorly secured folders, leaving digital fingerprints across every system he touched. It was in a folder marked Personal/Archive that Catherine found the smoking gun. The first message made her stomach lurch. "Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about your hands on me. When can we meet again?" The timestamp showed it was sent 3 weeks ago at 11:23 p.m., well after David would have been home with his wife and children. Catherine's hands trembled as she scrolled through months of correspondence. The messages painted a picture of a passionate affair, but also something more calculated and disturbing. Mixed between romantic exchanges were detailed discussions of client strategies, confidential financial information, and insider knowledge about upcoming pitches and contract negotiations. "Amanda, the Morrison account is vulnerable. They're having cash flow issues that aren't public yet. Your firm should move fast on the acquisition proposal we discussed." The message was signed with a heart emoji that made Catherine's skin crawl. "Amanda." Catherine pulled up the company's client database, searching for any Amanda connected to their major accounts. There, Amanda Reeves, marketing director at Pinnacle Strategies, their biggest client and, as these messages revealed, their biggest competitive threat. Catherine leaned back in her chair, the scope of David's betrayal finally becoming clear. He wasn't just violating employee privacy. He was committing corporate espionage, trading confidential information for personal and professional gain. The affair wasn't just adultery, it was treason against his own company. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision, documenting everything. Hotel receipts charged to personal credit cards but scheduled during work hours. Text messages discussing which accounts to target next. Most damning of all, a spreadsheet detailing client weaknesses and internal strategies that Amanda's firm could exploit. But it was the personal messages that made Catherine's investigation feel suddenly, uncomfortably intimate. Sarah asked about the late nights again, had to tell her it was a project deadline. "I hate lying to her, but what we have is too important to stop." Another message, "Saw your presentation to the Morrison team today. You looked incredible in that blue dress. Couldn't stop imagining taking it off you later." Catherine found herself staring at David's family photo on his desk, visible through his glass office walls, even in the dim after-hours lighting. Sarah Brennan smiled back at her from the frame. A kind-faced woman with laugh lines around her eyes, holding 2 young children who had David's dark hair and their mother's gentle expression. The weight of what Catherine had discovered settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. David's violations had seemed clear-cut when they only affected her, an invasion of privacy that demanded justice. But this evidence revealed innocent victims who had no idea their lives were built on lies and betrayal. Catherine opened her laptop and began researching Sarah Brennan, telling herself it was just thorough investigation. But as she scrolled through social media profiles, she found herself drawn into the life of a woman who seemed to embody everything Catherine respected. Sarah's Facebook showed a pediatric nurse who volunteered at children's charities, organized neighborhood cleanups, and posted proud updates about her kids' school achievements. Her Instagram revealed someone who found joy in simple moments: homemade dinners, family bike rides, quiet evenings reading on the porch. One post made Catherine's chest tighten. "Grateful for my husband working so hard to provide for our family. David's been putting in long hours on a big project, but he always makes time for good night stories with the kids. Some partnerships are worth the sacrifice." The timestamp showed it was posted the same night David had sent Amanda explicit messages about their hotel rendezvous. Catherine closed the laptop and stared at the evidence she'd compiled. Screenshots of intimate messages, financial records showing suspicious transactions, network logs proving David had been systematically sharing client intelligence with a competitor. The documentation was comprehensive enough to destroy David's career and marriage simultaneously. But as Catherine sat in the empty office, surrounded by the digital ruins of David's double life, she found herself facing a moral crossroads she hadn't anticipated. The man who had violated her privacy, who had built a surveillance network to control and manipulate his employees, who was committing corporate espionage, that man deserved whatever consequences his actions brought. But Sarah Brennan deserved better than to have her world destroyed by a stranger's quest for justice. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "How's the late-night research going? Find anything interesting?" She stared at the message for several minutes before responding. "Found more than I bargained for. Need to think about what to do with it." The elevator ride to the parking garage felt longer than usual, Catherine's reflection in the polished steel doors showing a woman she barely recognized. The methodical account manager who had started this investigation 3 days ago had been focused on documenting David's violations and reporting them through proper channels. The woman staring back at her now held information that could destroy multiple lives, and she wasn't sure which lives deserved destruction. As Catherine drove through Chicago's late-night streets, she found herself taking a detour past David's neighborhood. The house was a modest 2-story in a family-friendly suburb, with a tire swing in the front yard and children's bicycles scattered on the porch. Light glowed from the upstairs windows, bedtime stories being read, perhaps, or a tired mother helping with homework while her husband claimed to be working late. Catherine parked across the street and watched the domestic scene, her laptop bag heavy, with evidence sitting in the passenger seat. Inside that bag was the power to shatter the illusion of the happy family, to expose the lies and betrayal that made those warm lights possible. But also inside that bag was the evidence needed to stop David from victimizing other employees, from continuing his corporate espionage, from using his position of power to violate and manipulate everyone around him. The house went dark room by room as the family settled into sleep, unaware that their secrets sat in a Honda Civic across the street, waiting for a decision that would change everything. Catherine started her car and drove home, but sleep eluded her once again. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, weighing justice against compassion, wondering if there was a way to stop David without destroying Sarah and the children who had never chosen to be part of his web of lies. By morning, she would have to decide what kind of person she wanted to be, and what price she was willing to pay for justice. By morning, Catherine would have to decide what kind of person she wanted to be, and what price she was willing to pay for justice. But as dawn broke over Chicago, painting her apartment walls in soft gold, Catherine realized she didn't have to make this decision alone. The weight of David's secrets had kept her awake until 4 a.m., her mind cycling between righteous anger and unexpected empathy for Sarah Brennan. When exhaustion finally claimed her, Catherine's dreams were filled with fragmented images. David's smug smile, Sarah's trusting face, Amanda's calculating eyes, and always, the violation of her own privacy that had started this entire cascade. She woke with a plan. At 10:30 a.m., Catherine sat across from Michael Torres in his downtown law office, the city skyline stretching beyond floor-to-ceiling windows that made her feel dizzy with their height. Michael shared his sister Jessica's sharp intelligence, but where Jessica channeled hers into technology, Michael had built his career on understanding the intricate dance between law and ethics. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Michael said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed Catherine's carefully redacted summary. "Your manager violated multiple employees' privacy, engaged in corporate espionage, and is having an affair with a client representative. And you obtained this information through unauthorized network monitoring." Catherine shifted in the leather chair. "That's correct." "Catherine." Michael leaned forward, his expression grave. "What you're describing isn't just an HR issue. David's actions constitute criminal violations, corporate espionage, computer fraud, potentially even RICO violations if this surveillance system is as extensive as you believe. But your methods of obtaining this evidence could also be considered illegal. So what are you saying? That I should just ignore it? I'm saying you need to be very careful about how you proceed. Michael opened a legal pad and began writing. If you want to pursue this legitimately, you need to report it through proper channels. File a complaint with HR Contact, the FBI's Corporate Crimes Division. Work with legitimate investigators who can obtain evidence through legal means. Catherine felt a familiar frustration building. And how long will that take? How many more employees will David violate while proper channels move at bureaucratic speed? That's not your responsibility, Catherine. Your responsibility is to report the crime, not to investigate it yourself. Michael's voice carried the patient tone of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. I've seen people destroy their lives trying to pursue justice through illegal means. The ends don't justify the means, especially when those means could land you in federal prison. After leaving Michael's office, Catherine felt more conflicted than before. The proper channels he'd outlined seemed designed to protect institutions rather than victims, processes that could take months or years, while David continued his violations with impunity. Her next stop was Elena Vasquez's office. Elena was reviewing quarterly reports when Catherine knocked, but she immediately set aside her work with the focused attention Catherine had always admired. At 45, Elena had climbed the corporate ladder through a combination of brilliant strategic thinking and an unwavering commitment to protecting good employees from toxic management. Catherine, good to see you. What can I do for you? Catherine had prepared a careful approach, focusing on the workplace violations rather than the affair evidence. I've discovered some concerning information about David's management practices. Employee privacy violations, possible corporate espionage. I wanted to discuss the proper way to address this. Elena's expression grew serious. What kind of violations? Unauthorized access to personal emails, surveillance of employee activities, sharing confidential client information with external parties. Catherine watched Elena's face carefully. I have documentation, but I'm not sure about the best way to proceed. Catherine, I'm going to be completely honest with you. Elena closed her laptop and gave Catherine her full attention. I've been building a case against David for the past 4 months. His management style has created a toxic environment, and I've been documenting everything I can observe directly. But I need concrete evidence of actual policy violations to take action. Ah, what kind of evidence? The kind that would hold up in a formal investigation. Written complaints from affected employees, IT logs showing unauthorized access, documented instances of policy violations that can't be explained away as legitimate management oversight. Elena paused. Do you have that kind of evidence? Catherine thought about the screenshots on her laptop, the network logs Jessica had helped her obtain, the detailed documentation of David's digital crimes. Possibly. But there are complications about how the evidence was obtained. Catherine, I need you to understand something. Corporate investigations require ironclad evidence obtained through legitimate means. If there's any question about the legality of how evidence was gathered, it becomes unusable. Elena's voice carried a warning. Don't compromise a legitimate case by taking shortcuts. How long would a proper investigation take? Months, possibly longer. But Catherine, that's how justice works in the corporate world. Slowly, carefully, and with proper oversight. Catherine left Elena's office feeling the weight of institutional limitations. Everyone wanted her to follow proper channels that moved at glacial speed, while David continued his violations with each passing day. That evening, she met Jessica at a small wine bar in Lincoln Park, far from their office and the possibility of accidental encounters with colleagues. Jessica had chosen a corner table where their conversation couldn't be overheard, her paranoia about surveillance having increased since they'd begun their investigation. So what did the lawyer and the senior manager tell you? Jessica asked, swirling her Pinot Noir. Catherine summarized her conversations, watching Jessica's expression grow increasingly frustrated. They both basically said the same thing. Follow proper channels, accept that justice takes time, don't take matters into our own hands. That's easy for them to say, Jessica replied, her voice tight with anger. They're not the ones being violated every day. They're not the ones watching David destroy people's sense of security and dignity while hiding behind corporate authority. Michael warned me that pursuing this could land us in federal prison. And Elena warned you that proper channels could take years. Jessica leaned forward. Catherine, I've been thinking about this nonstop since our conversation started. David isn't going to stop. He's going to keep violating people's privacy, keep building his surveillance network, keep using his position to harm the people who work under him. Catherine sipped her wine, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on her. But what about Sarah? What about his children? They're innocent in all this. Are they more innocent than the employees David is victimizing? Jessica's question hung in the air between them. Catherine, I know this is complicated, but sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to expose them completely. David chose to risk his family when he decided to betray them. That's not my choice to make. Isn't it? Jessica's eyes were intense. You're the one who discovered his crimes. You're the one with the evidence. If you don't act, who will? Catherine stared into her wine glass, seeing her reflection distorted in the dark liquid. I don't know if I can live with destroying innocent people's lives. Can you live with letting guilty people continue destroying other innocent lives? The question followed Catherine home, echoing in her mind as she prepared for another sleepless night. She'd sought counsel from the people she trusted most, hoping for clarity, but had found only competing moral imperatives that seemed equally valid and equally impossible to reconcile. Michael represented the voice of legal caution, warning her that illegal means would corrupt any justice she might achieve. Elena embodied institutional responsibility, advocating for slow but legitimate processes that protected everyone's rights. Jessica channeled righteous anger, arguing that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures. But none of them had to live with the final decision. None of them would have to look in the mirror afterward and accept responsibility for the consequences, whatever they might be. As Catherine lay in bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows from passing cars played across the white paint, she realized that all the advice in the world couldn't resolve the fundamental moral conflict at the heart of her situation. David Brennan was a predator who used his authority to violate and manipulate the people under his power. He was committing crimes that damaged both his employees and his company. He deserved to face consequences for his actions. But Sarah Brennan was an innocent woman whose world would be shattered by revelations she'd never asked for. Her children were innocents who would pay a price for their father's crimes without understanding why their family was being destroyed. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to imagine explaining her choice to both women, justifying to Sarah why her marriage had to be destroyed to save Catherine's coworkers, or explaining to David's future victims why their suffering was acceptable collateral damage to preserve one family's illusion of happiness. Both conversations felt impossible. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to be the person who followed proper channels and accepted institutional limitations, or the person who took justice into her own hands, regardless of the collateral damage. The weight of other people's lives pressed down on her in the darkness, and Catherine Sloan realized that some decisions could only be made alone. The weight of other people's lives pressed down on Catherine in the darkness, and she realized that some decisions could only be made alone. But as morning light filtered through her apartment blinds, Catherine discovered there might be a third option, one that would test David's capacity for redemption before she committed to his destruction. She would give him a chance. At 9:15 a.m., Catherine knocked on David's office door, a manila folder clutched in her hands. Through the glass walls, she could see him reviewing what appeared to be employee performance metrics. His expression focused with the intensity he brought to all his surveillance activities. Catherine, come in, come in. David's smile was warm and professional, the same expression he'd worn when dismissing her privacy concerns days earlier. What can I do for you? Catherine settled into the chair across from his desk, placing the folder between them like a chess piece opening a complex game. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the security audit. I've done some additional research, and I've discovered some concerning patterns. David's smile never wavered, but Catherine caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Oh? What kind of patterns? Network activity logs showing unauthorized access to employee accounts. Personal emails being read during times when those employees were out of the office. Productivity monitoring that goes far beyond anything outlined in our employee handbook. Catherine opened the folder and slid a carefully edited printout across the desk. This isn't a security audit, David. This is systematic surveillance. The silence stretched between them for several heartbeats. Catherine watched David's face as he processed the evidence, seeing the rapid calculations behind his eyes as he assessed how much she knew and how much damage she could do. "Catherine," David said finally, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining a complex concept to a child. "I think you're misunderstanding the scope of legitimate management oversight. Sometimes protecting the team requires monitoring activities that might seem invasive to someone who doesn't understand the full picture. Reading personal therapy emails protects the team?" David's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing something colder underneath. "I think you're becoming paranoid about normal business practices. This kind of thinking could indicate that you're struggling with the demands of corporate life." It was a masterful deflection, designed to make Catherine question her own judgment, while subtly threatening her professional standing. But Catherine had prepared for this response. "David, I'm going to be direct with you." She leaned forward, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I know about the surveillance network. I know about the privacy violations. I know you've been systematically monitoring employees and using their personal information to manipulate and control them." David's professional facade began to crack. "That's a very serious accusation, Catherine. Do you have any idea what kind of legal trouble you could face for making false claims about a supervisor?" "I'm not making false claims." Catherine pulled out her phone and placed it on the desk between them, the voice recording app clearly visible and actively running. "I'm documenting a conversation with someone who has violated federal privacy laws and committed corporate espionage." The change in David was immediate and dramatic. The charming manager disappeared entirely, replaced by something desperate and dangerous. "Turn that off. Now." "No. Catherine, you don't understand what you're dealing with. This company has protocols, hierarchies, ways of handling internal disputes. Going outside those channels could destroy your career. The way you've destroyed other people's sense of privacy and dignity." David stood abruptly, beginning to pace behind his desk like a caged animal. "You're making a mistake. A very serious mistake. I've been trying to protect you, to help you succeed in this environment, but you're interpreting guidance as aggression. Protection doesn't involve reading my therapy emails." "I never." David stopped himself, realizing he'd almost admitted to the violation. "Catherine, I think you need to consider whether this job is a good fit for you. Sometimes people who can't handle corporate oversight would be happier in smaller, less demanding environments." The threat was clear, but Catherine felt a strange calm settling over her. She'd given David every opportunity to show remorse, to acknowledge his violations, to demonstrate that he understood the harm he'd caused. Instead, he doubled down on gaslighting and threats. "So you're not going to stop the surveillance? You're not going to respect employee privacy going forward?" "I'm going to continue managing my team in whatever way ensures optimal productivity and security." David's voice had grown cold and professional again. "If you can't accept legitimate management oversight, perhaps you should consider whether this position aligns with your personal comfort level." Catherine stopped the recording and slipped her phone back into her pocket. "I see. Good. I'm glad we could clear this up." David returned to his chair, his confident smile returning. "Now I'd suggest you focus on your actual job responsibilities rather than imaginary privacy violations. We have the Morrison presentation next week, and I'll need you to put in some extra hours to ensure it meets our standards." "Of course." Catherine gathered her folder and stood. "Thank you for clarifying your position." As Catherine left David's office, she felt a profound sense of closure. The test had revealed everything she needed to know about David Brennan's character. Given the opportunity to acknowledge his wrongs and change his behavior, he had instead escalated his threats and made it clear that he had no intention of stopping his violations. The man who had just threatened her career for documenting his crimes was the same man who went home each night to Sarah and the children, maintaining the illusion of being a loving husband and father while systematically violating the trust of everyone under his authority. Catherine returned to her desk and immediately opened her email, typing a message to Jessica. "The test failed. We proceed as planned." The response came back within minutes. "I'm sorry it came to that. Are you ready for the next phase?" Catherine stared at the message for several moments before responding, "Yes, it's time." That afternoon, Catherine found herself working with unusual focus, completing tasks with the efficiency of someone who knew her time at the company was limited. She updated project files, organized her client notes, and prepared transition documents with the thoroughness that had always characterized her work. But underneath the professional activity, her mind was planning something far more consequential than quarterly reports. At 3:47 p.m., her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Working late again tonight. Tell Sarah I'm in meetings until 9. Catherine stared at the message, realizing that David had sent it to the wrong contact. He'd meant to send it to Amanda Reeves, but had accidentally texted Catherine instead. The irony wasn't lost on her. David's attempt to maintain his web of lies had just provided her with real-time evidence of his deception. She screenshotted the message and added it to her growing evidence file. Then she looked up Sarah Brennan's workplace address and checked the visiting hours for Northwestern Memorial Hospital's pediatric unit. Catherine had given David every opportunity to choose redemption over destruction. He had chosen destruction, not just for himself, but for everyone whose lives he touched through his surveillance and manipulation. As the office began to empty around her, Catherine made her final preparations. She uploaded backup copies of all evidence to secure cloud storage, created detailed documentation of David's surveillance network, and prepared the carefully crafted message that would change everything. The woman who had started this journey seeking justice for a privacy violation had discovered something much larger and more disturbing than she'd ever imagined. David Brennan wasn't just a bad manager. He was a predator who used his position of authority to violate, manipulate, and control the people under his power. And predators, Catherine had learned, only understood one language: consequences. At 6:23 p.m., Catherine Sloan saved her work, gathered her personal belongings, and prepared to cross a line from which there would be no return. The test had failed, David's true nature had been revealed, and now it was time for justice, regardless of the collateral damage. The methodical account manager, who had always followed proper channels, was about to become someone else entirely. Someone who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to become willing to destroy the world that monster had built on lies. The methodical account manager, who had always followed proper channels, was about to become someone else entirely. Someone who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to become willing to destroy the world that monster had built on lies. Catherine's transformation began that evening in Jessica's apartment, where the two women worked with the focused intensity of generals planning a campaign. The exposed brick walls and humming servers created an atmosphere that felt more like a war room than a living space, and Catherine realized that's exactly what it had become. "First rule of digital warfare," Jessica said, pulling up multiple screens of code and network logs, "is understanding that once you deploy your weapons, there's no calling them back. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" Catherine thought about David's cold dismissal that morning, his threats, his complete lack of remorse for the violations he'd committed against her and others. He made his choice. Now I'm making mine. Then we do this right. Jessica's fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "We create a comprehensive package that can't be dismissed, ignored, or explained away. Multiple redundancies, multiple delivery methods, and enough evidence to ensure that even if David tries to destroy some of it, enough remains to bring him down." Over the next 4 hours, they meticulously organized months of evidence into a devastating dossier. Network logs showing unauthorized access to employee accounts. Screenshots of David's surveillance spreadsheets ranking employees by, quote, loyalty indicators. Email communications revealing his affair with Amanda Reeves. financial records documenting corporate espionage through shared client intelligence. But Catherine knew that destroying David's career and marriage was only half the battle. She also had to protect herself from the inevitable retaliation. "What about my own exposure?" Catherine asked as they compiled the final evidence package. "Michael warned me that my methods of obtaining this information could be considered illegal. That's why we're being smart about this." Jessica pulled up a sophisticated document that looked like a legal brief. "I've been working on this for weeks. We present your discoveries as the result of noticing irregularities and conducting legitimate investigation within your rights as an employee. The deeper network analysis appears to come from anonymous sources, whistleblowers within the IT department, who were concerned about David's requests but afraid to come forward directly." Catherine studied the carefully crafted narrative. It was plausible, protecting both her and Jessica while ensuring the evidence would be taken seriously. "You've thought of everything." "I've had to. I've been watching David abuse his authority for months, documenting his violations, waiting for someone brave enough to stand up to him." Jessica saved the final document and turned to face Catherine. "You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for every employee he's violated, and every employee he'll violate in the future." While Jessica handled the technical aspects of their digital warfare, Catherine focused on the human elements. She spent the weekend researching David's family, not out of voyeuristic curiosity, but with the clinical thoroughness of someone preparing for the collateral damage her actions would cause. Sarah Brennan worked as a pediatric nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, specializing in children with chronic illnesses. Her social media revealed someone whose life was built around caring for others: her patients, her children, her community. She coached her daughter's soccer team, organized charity drives for the hospital, and posted pictures of family dinners that radiated warmth and stability. Catherine found herself staring at a photo from last month: David and Sarah at their son's school play, both beaming with pride as 8-year-old Michael took his bow in a paper crown. Sarah's hand rested on David's arm with comfortable intimacy, her smile genuine and trusting. In the comments, friends praised them as, quote, "relationship goals," and, quote, "the perfect family." The image made Catherine's stomach turn, not because she was having second thoughts, but because it crystallized the scope of David's betrayal. While Sarah was building a life based on love and trust, David was systematically violating both through his surveillance network and affair with Amanda. Catherine also researched Amanda Reeves more thoroughly, and what she discovered reinforced her conviction that both David and Amanda deserved whatever consequences their actions brought. Amanda's LinkedIn profile revealed a pattern of career advancement that coincided suspiciously with strategic relationships with male executives. Her previous positions had ended with competitors gaining unexpected advantages in major contracts, and at least 2 of her former male colleagues had faced divorce proceedings citing adultery. Amanda wasn't just David's affair partner. She was a professional predator who used intimacy as a weapon for corporate espionage. By Sunday evening, Catherine had made peace with the human cost of her actions. Sarah and the children would suffer, but their suffering was David's responsibility, not hers. Every day Catherine delayed action meant more employees falling victim to David's surveillance, more confidential information flowing to competitors through Amanda, more abuse of power going unchecked. Catherine spent Sunday night writing and rewriting the message that would trigger everything. It needed to be carefully calibrated, providing enough context for Sarah to understand the scope of David's betrayal, while avoiding language that could be construed as harassment or extortion. "Dear Mrs. Brennan," the final version began, "I am an employee at your husband's company, and I am writing to inform you of behavior that affects not only his professional responsibilities, but also his personal commitments to your family. I believe you deserve to know the truth about how your husband conducts himself when he claims to be working late." The message went on to detail David's affair with Amanda, providing dates, locations, and evidence, while explaining how the affair was connected to corporate espionage that threatened the livelihoods of David's coworkers. Catherine attached selected screenshots and hotel receipts, enough to prove her claims without overwhelming Sarah with pornographic details. She also prepared secondary packages for HR, Elena Vasquez, and the FBI's Corporate Crimes Division. Each package was tailored to its audience but contained overlapping evidence that would create a coordinated response David couldn't manipulate or control. On Monday morning, Catherine arrived at work with the calm focus of someone who had crossed an internal threshold. She updated her resume, reaching out to contacts in her professional network with subtle inquiries about opportunities. She also began documenting every interaction with David, knowing that he would likely escalate his retaliation once her actions became known. At lunch, she drove to Northwestern Memorial Hospital and sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes, watching healthcare workers come and go. She wasn't planning to approach Sarah directly. That would be stalking, and Catherine refused to become the kind of person who violated others' boundaries. But she wanted to see the environment where Sarah worked, to understand the life that would be shattered by the revelations Catherine was about to deliver. Through the hospital's glass entrance, Catherine could see nurses moving with purposeful efficiency, their scrubs marking them as people who dedicated their lives to healing others. Somewhere in that building, Sarah Brennan was caring for sick children, completely unaware that her marriage was built on lies, and that those lies were about to be exposed by a stranger. Catherine started her car and drove back to the office, her resolve hardened by the contrast between Sarah's innocent dedication and David's calculated betrayal. That afternoon, she made her final preparations. She created anonymous email accounts for delivering evidence to various recipients. She set up automated systems that would distribute backup copies of all evidence if anything happened to the primary packages. She even prepared a resignation letter, knowing that regardless of the investigation's outcome, her time at the company was ending. At 4:47 p.m., Catherine received confirmation that David had left early for what his calendar marked as a client dinner, though Catherine's evidence suggested it was actually a rendezvous with Amanda at the Palmer House Hotel. The irony was perfect. While David was committing the very acts of betrayal that Catherine was about to expose, she was putting the finishing touches on the digital weapons that would destroy the life he'd built on lies and violations. Catherine saved her work, backed up her files one final time, and prepared to launch the most consequential action of her professional life. The woman who had started this journey seeking an apology for a privacy violation had become someone capable of systematic destruction in the name of justice. Tomorrow, she would deploy her carefully crafted evidence packages and watch as David Brennan's world collapsed under the weight of his own choices. But tonight, Catherine Sloan sat in her office planning war and discovered she had developed a taste for strategic thinking that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. The predator was about to become prey, and Catherine was ready to pull the trigger. The predator was about to become prey, and Catherine was ready to pull the trigger. But David Brennan would provide the final justification for her actions in the most public and humiliating way possible. The weekly team meeting convened at 9 a.m. sharp in the glass-walled conference room, with David presiding over his staff like a general reviewing troops. Catherine sat in her usual spot near the back, laptop open, appearing to take notes, while actually making final preparations for the digital warfare she would launch within hours. Before we dive into project updates, David began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when making pronouncements. I want to address some concerning behavior I've observed recently. Catherine's fingers paused over her keyboard, sensing a shift in the room's atmosphere. It's come to my attention that some team members have been questioning legitimate management protocols. David's eyes swept the room before landing on Catherine with laser focus. Specifically, there seems to be confusion about what constitutes appropriate workplace privacy versus necessary business oversight. The other attendees shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Mark Peterson from the Morrison account glanced nervously at Catherine, while Lisa Chen stared down at her hands. They could sense the tension building but didn't understand its source. I want to be crystal clear about something, David continued, his voice gaining intensity. When an employee demonstrates paranoid behavior, makes unfounded accusations against supervisors, and shows signs of being unable to handle the demands of corporate life, that becomes a team problem. Catherine felt every eye in the room turn toward her, the targeting so obvious that even Elena Vasquez, who had joined the meeting as an observer, leaned forward with concern. David, Elena interjected carefully, perhaps we should discuss specific performance issues in private. No, I think this needs to be addressed openly. David pulled out a folder that Catherine recognized with growing horror. It contained printouts of her therapy appointment emails, the personal correspondence about her family conflicts, even the messages discussing her adjustment difficulties that he'd violated her privacy to obtain. When someone sends emails discussing trust issues with authority figures, David read from the papers, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. That suggests they may not be emotionally equipped for collaborative leadership environments. The blood drained from Catherine's face as she realized David was publicly weaponizing the most private details of her mental health journey. Around the conference table, her colleagues stared in stunned silence at the unprecedented violation of professional boundaries. Furthermore, David continued, warming to his theme, when someone begins making accusations about imaginary surveillance and expressing paranoid delusions about management oversight, we have to ask whether they're creating a hostile work environment for their teammates. Catherine's laptop screen showed the unsent email to Sarah Brennan, complete with evidence attachments, waiting for her to press send. Her phone contained the anonymous messages to HR and the FBI. But in this moment, watching David publicly humiliate her using her own stolen words, Catherine felt something cold and final settle in her chest. "I think we all want Catherine to succeed here," David said, his tone shifting to false compassion. "But success requires accepting feedback, following protocols, and maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. When someone can't do those things, it affects team morale and productivity." Elena Vasquez had gone pale, recognizing that she was witnessing something that crossed every line of professional conduct. "David, I need to stop this meeting. What I'm doing is protecting this team from toxic behavior," David interrupted. "Catherine, I'm recommending that you take some time to consider whether this position is a good fit for your particular needs. Perhaps a smaller company with less demanding oversight requirements would better suit your comfort level." The silence in the conference room was deafening. Catherine could see the horror on her colleagues' faces as they processed what they'd just witnessed. A manager publicly attacking an employee, using their most private information as ammunition. Catherine stood slowly, her laptop still open, her finger hovering over the send button. "Thank you for clarifying your position, David. I hope you'll take some time to reflect on what we've discussed today," David replied, his smile returning as he sensed victory. "Professional growth requires accepting difficult feedback. Oh, I've learned a great deal from this conversation." Catherine's voice was steady, almost conversational. "About professional boundaries, about acceptable behavior, about what happens when someone mistakes mercy for weakness." She pressed send. The email to Sarah Brennan launched into cyberspace, followed immediately by the anonymous packages to HR, Elena Vasquez, and the FBI's Corporate Crimes Division. Catherine's phone buzzed as Jessica's automated backup systems activated, distributing evidence to multiple repositories that David would never be able to identify or control. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Catherine," David said, already turning his attention to the next agenda item. "Mark, let's discuss the Morrison presentation timeline." Catherine closed her laptop and gathered her belongings. "David, you should probably check your phone." "I'm in a meeting, Catherine. Whatever personal drama you're manufacturing can wait." "It's not personal anymore." Catherine walked toward the conference room door, then paused. "Elena, you might want to check your email in the next few minutes. You'll find some interesting documentation about management practices that HR should review." Elena's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as she processed Catherine's words. Around the table, the other team members sensed that something significant had just occurred, though they couldn't yet understand what. "Catherine, sit down," David commanded, his voice taking on an edge of panic. "We're not finished with this discussion." "Yes, we are." Catherine opened the glass door, then looked back at David one final time. "You were right about one thing, though. I am creating a hostile work environment for people who abuse their authority and violate their employees' privacy. That was always the point." Catherine walked out of the conference room, through the open plan office, and toward the elevator, leaving behind a wake of stunned silence. Behind her, she could hear David's voice rising in pitch as he tried to regain control of a meeting that had just spiraled beyond his influence. In the elevator, Catherine's reflection stared back at her from the polished steel doors. She looked the same as she had an hour ago, but something fundamental had changed. The woman who had entered that conference room hoping for professional resolution had left as someone who understood that some battles could only be won through total warfare. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Packages delivered. No going back now. Are you ready for what comes next?" Catherine typed back. He made his choice. In front of witnesses. Now everyone gets to see the consequences. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, Catherine felt a strange combination of satisfaction and apprehension. She had given David every opportunity to show remorse, to change his behavior, to demonstrate basic human decency. Instead, he had chosen to escalate his abuse, to weaponize her most private struggles, to prove beyond any doubt that he was exactly the predator she had believed him to be. The elevator reached the parking garage, and Catherine walked toward her Honda Civic with measured steps. Behind her, 20 floors above, the digital weapons she had launched were beginning their work of systematic destruction. Sarah Brennan was about to discover her husband's betrayal. HR was about to receive evidence of corporate espionage. The FBI was about to open an investigation that would reshape multiple lives. Catherine had crossed her final line, and there would be no going back. But as she started her car and drove toward an uncertain future, she realized she felt no regret about the choice she'd made. David Brennan had built his career on violating other people's boundaries. Now he was about to learn what happened when someone violated all of his. David Brennan had built his career on violating other people's boundaries. Now he was about to learn what happened when someone violated all of his. Catherine drove home in a strange state of calm, her phone buzzing with notifications that she ignored. The digital weapons were deployed, the evidence was spreading through multiple channels, and there was nothing left to do but wait for the explosion. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, but as Chicago's skyline receded in her rearview mirror, Catherine felt lighter than she had in weeks. The first sign that her plan was working came at 11:47 a.m. Catherine was sitting in her apartment, mechanically eating a sandwich while staring at her laptop screen, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. "Is this Catherine Sloan?" The voice was female, strained and unfamiliar. "Yes, who is this?" "This is Sarah Brennan." The name hit Catherine like a physical blow. I received your email this morning. I need to know if what you sent me is real." Catherine's carefully planned responses fled her mind as she confronted the human reality of what she'd done. Sarah's voice carried a tremor that spoke of a world crumbling in real time, of trust being shattered with surgical precision. "Mrs. Brennan, Please, just tell me if it's real. The hotel receipts, the messages, all of it. Is my husband really?" Sarah's voice broke, and Catherine could hear her struggling to maintain composure. "Yes," Catherine said quietly. "It's all real. I'm sorry." The silence stretched between them for several heartbeats before Sarah spoke again, her voice smaller now. "How long have you known?" "I discovered it during my investigation into his workplace violations. I didn't go looking for information about his personal life, but when I found evidence of corporate espionage, the affair was part of the same pattern." "Corporate espionage?" Sarah's voice sharpened. "What are you talking about?" Catherine found herself explaining David's surveillance network, his violations of employee privacy, his sharing of confidential information with Amanda Reeves. As she spoke, she could hear Sarah's breathing grow more labored, the scope of her husband's betrayal expanding beyond marital infidelity into professional corruption. "He's been reading your emails?" Sarah asked finally. "Among other things, he built an entire system to monitor and control his employees. The affair with Amanda was part of a larger pattern of using personal relationships to gain information and power." "I see." Sarah's voice had gone flat, the initial shock giving way to something harder. "Miss Sloan, I want you to know that I don't blame you for telling me, but I need to ask, why did you choose to destroy my family to expose his workplace behavior?" The question Catherine had been dreading hung in the air between them. "Because he gave me no choice. I tried to address his violations through proper channels. I even confronted him directly, hoping he would show remorse and change his behavior. Instead, he escalated his abuse and threatened my career. This morning, He publicly humiliated me using private information he stole from my personal emails. So this is revenge. Catherine considered lying, offering a sanitized version that made her actions seem purely altruistic. But Sarah Brennan deserved honesty, even if it was ugly. Partially, yes, but also justice. David won't stop violating people's boundaries until he faces real consequences. I couldn't let him continue hurting people just to preserve your family's comfort. Another long silence then. I understand. And Miss Sloan? Thank you for giving me the truth, even though it hurts. The line went dead, leaving Catherine staring at her phone with a mixture of relief and profound sadness. Sarah Brennan had handled the revelation with more grace than Catherine had expected, but that somehow made the destruction feel heavier rather than lighter. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. David's been trying to call you. HR wants to see him this afternoon. Elena's in emergency meetings with legal. It's working. But Catherine's satisfaction was interrupted by another call, this time from a number she recognized, Amanda Reeves. You have no idea what you've done. Amanda's voice was ice-cold and furious. David just called me in a panic about some delusional employee who's been stalking him and making up stories about our professional relationship. Professional relationship? Catherine almost laughed. Is that what you're calling corporate espionage now? I don't know what you think you have, but if you try to drag me into David's workplace drama, you'll discover that I have lawyers who specialize in destroying people who make false accusations. I'm sure you do. But I'm also sure they'll be interested in the evidence I've provided to the FBI about your pattern of using intimate relationships to steal confidential information from competitors. The silence on Amanda's end told Catherine everything she needed to know. What evidence? Hotel receipts showing meetings timed with major client presentations. Email exchanges where David shared confidential strategic information. Financial records showing suspicious gains for your company after each of your affairs, with executives from competing firms. Catherine felt a cold satisfaction as she listed the documentation. You've built your entire career on corporate espionage, Amanda. Did you really think no one would notice the pattern? You don't understand the position you've put yourself in. Amanda's voice had shifted from fury to something more calculated and dangerous. I have connections, resources, ways of making problems disappear. If you think you can destroy my reputation based on speculation and circumstantial evidence, I'm not trying to destroy your reputation, Catherine interrupted. I'm simply documenting your crimes and letting appropriate authorities draw their own conclusions. But Amanda, if you try to retaliate against me or anyone else involved in exposing David's violations, you'll discover that I've prepared for that contingency too. Catherine hung up before Amanda could respond, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline of confrontation faded. The conversation had revealed something she hadn't fully anticipated. Amanda was more dangerous than she'd realized, someone with resources and connections that could pose a serious threat. Her phone rang again, this time displaying Elena Vasquez's number. Catherine, where are you? Elena's voice was tense but not accusatory. We need to talk immediately. Can you come in? Am I being summoned for disciplinary action? You're being summoned for protection, Elena said grimly. After what happened in that conference room this morning, combined with the evidence packages that have been flooding into HR and legal departments all afternoon, we have a situation that's spiraling beyond normal corporate protocols. What kind of situation? The kind where the FBI is scheduling interviews for next week, where our biggest client is threatening to terminate their contract, and where David Brennan has barricaded himself in his office refusing to speak to anyone. Elena paused. Catherine, what you've uncovered isn't just a workplace violation. It's a criminal conspiracy that could bring down multiple companies and destroy dozens of careers. Catherine felt the weight of unintended consequences settling on her shoulders. She had wanted to stop David's violations and expose his crimes, but she hadn't fully considered how many other lives would be affected by the investigation she'd triggered. Elena, I need you to understand something. I tried to do this the right way. I followed proper channels, sought legal advice, attempted to resolve it internally. David escalated the situation at every turn until this was the only option left. I believe you. And Catherine? What David did in that conference room this morning was witnessed by 6 people, including me. He violated so many company policies and federal laws that his termination is inevitable, regardless of anything else you've uncovered. As Catherine drove back toward the office, she realized that her careful plan for targeted destruction had unleashed something far larger and more chaotic than she'd intended. David's world was indeed collapsing, but the debris was spreading in directions she hadn't anticipated, affecting innocent people who had never chosen to be part of this conflict. The woman who had started this journey seeking an apology for a privacy violation had become the architect of a corporate catastrophe that would reshape multiple lives forever. And the most unsettling part was that Catherine still felt no regret about the choice she'd made. Some boundaries, once crossed, demanded consequences regardless of collateral damage. David Brennan was about to learn that lesson in the most devastating way possible. Some boundaries, once crossed, demanded consequences regardless of collateral damage. David Brennan was about to learn that lesson in the most devastating way possible. But Catherine was discovering that being the architect of justice came with a price she hadn't fully calculated. 3 days after the digital weapons launched, Catherine sat in a downtown coffee shop she'd never visited before, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast Chicago morning. The familiar rhythms of her life had become impossible as reporters, investigators, and corporate lawyers all sought to understand her role in what the Chicago Tribune was calling the Brennan surveillance scandal. Her phone buzzed with yet another unknown number. She'd stopped answering calls from journalists after the 5th interview request, but this one came with a text that made her stomach clench. "This is Marcus Chen, Lisa's husband. We need to talk." Catherine remembered Lisa Chen from the conference room, one of her colleagues who had witnessed David's public humiliation. She answered the call with growing dread. "Mr. Chen? My wife came home crying 3 days ago." Marcus's voice was tight with controlled anger. "She told me about what happened in that meeting, about the manager who attacked you with your personal information. But then yesterday, she got a call from FBI investigators wanting to interview her about a federal case." Catherine closed her eyes. "I'm sorry. I never intended for other employees to be dragged into." "You don't understand," Marcus interrupted. "Lisa's on a work visa. Any involvement in a federal investigation, even as a witness, could affect her immigration status. She's terrified that helping expose this guy's crimes could get her deported." The coffee shop's ambient noise faded as Catherine confronted another unintended consequence of her digital warfare. "Mr. Chen, the investigation is about David's crimes, not about the employees he victimized. You think the federal government makes those distinctions? You think they care about nuance when they're processing immigration cases?" Marcus's voice cracked with frustration. "My wife has been in this country for 6 years, working toward citizenship. Now she's afraid to cooperate with investigators because it might destroy everything she's built here." Catherine stared at her untouched coffee, the weight of other people's lives settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "What can I do to help?" "I don't know, but I needed you to understand that your war against this manager didn't just affect him. It's affecting innocent people who never chose to be part of this fight." After Marcus hung up, Catherine sat in stunned silence, processing the ripple effects she hadn't anticipated. Her phone immediately rang again, this time a number she recognized with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Catherine?" Sarah Brennan's voice was stronger than it had been 3 days ago, but carried an exhaustion that went bone deep. "I hope you don't mind me calling again. I have some things I need to tell you." "Of course. How are you holding up?" "I'm staying with my sister while David moves out of the house." Sarah's voice was carefully controlled. "But that's not why I'm calling. Other people have been reaching out to me. Women whose husbands work with David. Employees from his previous companies. Your actions opened floodgates that neither of us expected." Catherine felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of floodgates?" "David's surveillance network was apparently much larger than even you discovered. A woman named Patricia Mills contacted me yesterday. Her husband worked under David at his previous company 5 years ago. She said David had accessed her husband's emails and used personal information about their marriage problems to manipulate his performance reviews. The scope of David's violations kept expanding, revealing a pattern of abuse that stretched back years across multiple companies. How many people are coming forward? Dozens so far. Employees, their families, even some clients who suspect their confidential information was compromised. Sarah paused. Catherine, I need you to understand something. I'm grateful that you exposed David's crimes. But the investigation you triggered has created a media circus that's affecting a lot of innocent people. What do you mean? Reporters are camping outside our children's school. David's affair with Amanda Reeves made national news because of the corporate espionage angle. My 8-year-old son asked me yesterday why strangers were taking pictures of him on the playground. Sarah's voice broke slightly. I know David brought this on himself, but our children didn't deserve to become public figures in a scandal they don't understand. Catherine felt the familiar weight of unintended consequences pressing down on her. Every action she'd taken had been justified by David's crimes, but the collateral damage was spreading in ways she'd never anticipated. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never intended for your family to become public. I know you didn't. But Catherine, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Sarah's voice took on a different quality, sharper and more focused. When you sent me that evidence about David's affair, did you consider other ways to stop his workplace violations? Ways that wouldn't have destroyed my marriage and traumatized my children? The question Catherine had been avoiding for 3 days finally cornered her in a public coffee shop, forcing her to confront the moral complexity of her choices. I tried other approaches first. I reported him through proper channels, consulted with lawyers, attempted direct confrontation. Nothing worked. But did you try going to the FBI about the corporate espionage without exposing the affair? Did you explore ways to stop his surveillance network without destroying his family? Catherine stared out the coffee shop window, watching Chicago's morning commuters hurry past without any awareness of the moral reckoning happening inside. The affair was tied to the corporate espionage. Amanda was using the relationship to gain access to confidential information. That's not what I asked. Sarah's voice was patient but relentless. I asked if you considered ways to pursue justice that didn't require destroying innocent people's lives as collateral damage. The honest answer was that Catherine had become so focused on ensuring David faced consequences for his violations that she'd stopped looking for solutions that might preserve Sarah's family. The affair evidence had been her nuclear option, and after David's public humiliation of her, she'd deployed it without fully considering alternatives. You're right, Catherine said quietly. I had other options. I chose the one that would cause David the most personal damage because I was angry about what he'd done to me. Thank you for being honest. Sarah's voice carried no accusation, only a tired acceptance. Catherine, I don't blame you for David's crimes, but I need you to understand that your choice to expose his affair wasn't just about justice. It was about revenge. And revenge always has a cost that goes beyond the target. After Sarah hung up, Catherine sat in the coffee shop for another hour, her mind cycling through the expanding web of consequences her actions had created. Lisa Chen facing potential deportation for witnessing David's violations. Sarah's children being harassed by reporters. Dozens of other families being dragged into federal investigations they'd never asked to join. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Amanda Reeves just hired a crisis management firm and threatened to sue the company for defamation. She's claiming the affair evidence was fabricated. Legal wants to meet with us tomorrow. Catherine stared at the message, realizing that Amanda's counterattack was just beginning. The woman who had used intimate relationships as weapons for corporate espionage wasn't going to accept destruction quietly. She was going to fight back with every resource at her disposal. As Catherine finally left the coffee shop, pulling her hood up against the October wind, she realized that her digital warfare had accomplished its primary objective. David's surveillance network was exposed, his violations were documented, and his ability to harm other employees was permanently ended. But the cost of that victory was higher than she'd anticipated. Innocent people were paying prices they'd never agreed to, families were being destroyed for crimes they hadn't committed. And Catherine was discovering that being an architect of justice meant accepting responsibility for every brick that fell when the structure collapsed. The woman who had started this journey seeking an apology for a privacy violation had become someone who understood that justice and revenge were often indistinguishable, and that the weight of other people's suffering could be as heavy as the satisfaction of seeing crimes exposed. As she walked toward an uncertain future, Catherine realized that some victories came with a lifetime of consequences, and that the line between hero and villain might be thinner than she'd ever imagined. 3 months after the coffee shop revelation, Catherine sat across from Sarah Brennan in a quiet cafe near Northwestern Memorial Hospital, both women changed by the ordeal that had brought them together and torn Sarah's family apart. The media circus had finally died down, the federal investigations had concluded, and the dust was beginning to settle on what remained of their lives. "David was sentenced this morning," Sarah said quietly, stirring her tea with mechanical precision. 18 months for corporate espionage, plus restitution to the company. Amanda got 2 years. Catherine nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret at the news. David's surveillance network had been completely dismantled, and the FBI investigation had revealed violations stretching back nearly a decade. He would never again be in a position to abuse his authority over vulnerable employees. "How are the children handling everything?" "Better than I expected. Children are remarkably resilient when adults are honest with them." Sarah's voice carried a strength that hadn't been there 3 months ago. "I told them their father made serious mistakes that hurt people, and that sometimes adults have to face consequences for their choices. Michael asked if that meant he couldn't trust grown-ups anymore, and I told him it meant he should trust people who earn it through their actions, not their titles." Catherine studied Sarah's face, seeing someone who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. "And you? How are you doing?" "I'm better. The divorce was finalized last month, and I've started dating someone, a fellow nurse who treats me with the respect I never realized I deserved." Sarah smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Catherine had seen from her. "Funny how sometimes destruction creates space for something better to grow." "I've been thinking about that a lot," Catherine said. "About the difference between destruction and renovation. Whether what I did was justice or just elaborate revenge." "Does it matter?" Sarah asked. "David's crimes are exposed. His ability to harm people is ended. Other companies are implementing stronger privacy protections because of the precedent this case set. Sometimes the motivation matters less than the results." Catherine pulled out an envelope and slid it across the table. "I wanted you to have this." Sarah opened it to find a check for $50,000. "Catherine, I can't. It's from the settlement with Amanda's company. They paid damages to avoid criminal charges, and Elena made sure I received compensation for the violations I suffered. I want you to have it. For the children's education, for whatever they need that David's incarceration makes difficult." Sarah stared at the check, tears forming in her eyes. "You know what the strangest part of all this is? I'm grateful it happened. Not for the pain, but for the truth. I was living a lie for 8 years, and you gave me the chance to build something real." As they parted ways outside the cafe, Catherine reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a violated employee into someone who understood the complex weight of justice. She had learned that stopping predators sometimes required becoming willing to accept collateral damage, that the line between hero and villain was often invisible, and that some victories came with lifelong consequences. But she had also learned that truth, however painful, created space for authentic relationships to grow. That courage, however imperfect, could inspire others to stand up for themselves. And that sometimes the only way to protect future victims was to ensure that current perpetrators faced real consequences. Catherine walked toward her new job at a cybersecurity firm, where her experience with digital privacy violations had made her invaluable in protecting other companies from similar abuses. The methodical account manager who had discovered her emails violated had become someone who helped others defend their boundaries before violations occurred. The weight of other people's lives would always be with her, but Catherine had learned to carry it as a reminder of responsibility rather than a burden of guilt. Some boundaries, once crossed, demanded consequences. And sometimes, the person willing to enforce those consequences had to accept the moral complexity of their choices. David Brennan had taught her that privacy was fragile and trust could be weaponized. But Catherine had learned something more important, that defending others sometimes required accepting the cost of your own moral complexity, and that the willingness to pay that price was what separated justice from mere compliance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote.